Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I speak on the Treasury Laws Amendment 2023, Measures No. 1, Bill 2023. One Nation supports an efficient, honest and fair tax system. An important aspect of a fair system is to make sure tax is not double charged. That's what franking credits do. They make sure a tax is not double charged. They ensure that Australians don't pay income tax on the parts of dividends on which the government has already collected company tax. That's fair. There's no reason to allow the government to double dip on Australian profits and then again on Australians' income. In the 2019 election campaign, Labor proposed changes to the franking credit system. Australia rejected completely those thought bubbles, completely rejected. Labor learnt from that lesson and for the 2022 election promised there would be no changes made to frank dividends if Australia voted them into government. Yet now that Labor is in government, Schedule 4 and 5 make a number of wholesale changes to how the dividend, share buyback and franking system currently works. Wholesale changes. Broken promise. Yet another to add to Labor's list of broken promises. Just like when they promised to reduce your power bills by $275, Labor's promise that they wouldn't touch franking credits was a lie. As always, the government claims that these are simply modest changes. They're anything but modest, with large implications for companies and for capital markets. The government hasn't been able to articulate the need for nor quantify how big of an impact these changes will have. They're doing it and they don't even know what will happen. We cannot legislate on a hope, a vibe, a wish that it will be okay. While that is, according to some in government, Prime Minister Albanese's modus operandi, it's not a responsible way to steer a $1.7 trillion economy. It's highly irresponsible. One Nation will be opposing these changes in Schedule 4 and 5 and cannot pass the bill if they remain part of this package. Schedule 2 lays the groundwork for standards that align money to climate goals. This would presumably be to create alignment with the greatest scam in finance, ESG standards, environment, social and governance. The powers that be call them sustainability standards, yet there's nothing sustainable about them. In fact, UN sustainability policies survive only as parasites on subsidies from the real economy. Subsidies. That makes them unsustainable. So-called sustainability standards talk about protecting the financial system from risks, yet they cannot quantify what those risks are. The idea that the government, or worse yet, a single bureaucratic department, can ever predict and quantify risk to the financial system is sheer lunacy. A brief analysis of history shows that. Did government and regulatory agencies see the risk of the dot-com bubble coming in the 2000s? No, they had no idea. Did the American regulators see the risk of subprime mortgages leading to the global financial crisis? No, they arguably participated in it and made it far worse. Did any regulator around the world predict the risk of almost every government in the world going certifiably insane in response to COVID, a bad flu? No, they did not. Over the last 3 years, the Reserve Bank created $500 billion in electronic journal entries, money concocted out of thin air. Did any regulator predict the risk that would lead to the skyrocketing inflation we're still trying to get under control? No, they did not. Actually, some did, and we were ridiculed. The point here, ridiculed by the experts. The point here is very simple. The government and the regulators cannot quantify the risk of financial system shocks. History shows governments are hilariously bad at it. They certainly won't be able to do it for supposed climate risks that are nothing more than fabrications concocted from inherent, natural, cyclical variation. By the way, everything in nature, everything in existence varies, yet understanding of variation is not taught in schools and rarely taught properly, if at all, at universities. That's why Greens, Labor, Teals and, sadly, some Liberal Nationals spout nonsense in this chamber and in public, concocting and spreading imaginary fears of climate apocalypse, when reality shows simply inherent, natural, cyclical variation. They cannot even come up with the only sound and essential basis for policy. That is, they've never quantified the specific effect of carbon dioxide from human activity. That means they have no basis for climate and energy policy, no specific quantified goals for climate and energy policy, no means of measuring progress towards those goals. We're flying blind. Australia is flying blind, and energy costs and climate policies are out of control and needlessly imposing huge costs on families, small businesses, our country and our nation's future. Anyway, the only thing we can do to protect against systemic risks is make sure that financial intermediaries are well capitalised and diversified to survive any risk that comes to fruition. Doing anything else encourages a lack of diversification and actually increases risk. I don't believe in this climate apocalypse nonsense, this climate fraud. Yet even for those who do fall for this illusion, there's no serious risk to anything. So let's look at the supposed science around climate risk. When I ask the government why we need to cut human production of carbon dioxide, they point me to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN IPCC. They're a dodgy bunch, proven over 40-plus years. Yet I don't think anyone in here has actually read the IPCC reports they claim as proof the climate is going to collapse. If you go to their report, the IPCC Assessment Report 6, Chapter 12 is the summary of Working Group 1, who looked at the actual science around natural disasters. Table 12.12 summarises all of the available evidence on the frequency of extreme weather events. Let me read out the types of natural disasters where even the United Nations has said there has been no detectable increase in the number of natural disasters. I'll repeat that. No detectable increase in frost, river flood, rain measured in terms of mean precipitation or heavy precipitation, landslide, drought, fire weather, wind speed, windstorm, tropical cyclones, dust storm, heavy snowfall, hail, relative sea level, coastal flood and marine heatwave, and on and on. Although I do not put any trust in the United Nations, government claims it does. And the United Nations says there has been no increase in severe weather events in those categories. None. Even better, Table 12.12 in the IPCC AR6 says the United Nations doesn't expect to see any detectable increase in those categories in the next 80 years under their worst-case scenario. There's no risk to the financial system from climate change because there's no need to cut human production of carbon dioxide. End of story. As an aside, I ask, on what basis does Minister Watt get his frequent, fanciful, scary claims of increasing extreme weather events? Wild imagination, Senator Watt? From where do the Greens get their dishonest claims? From where does Senator Pocock get his pseudoscience to support his Kermit Green fantasy policies? Is it the family money of Simon Holmes à Court, who now relies on the millions of green subsidy dollars that support otherwise unsustainable and failing wind and solar net zero projects? Parasitic subsidies from energy users, and taxpayers who pay through needlessly higher prices. Recently in this chamber, I heard Senator David Pocock cite scientists who said they have fears for the climate. Significantly, he did not provide any science to back it up. Apparently, because he seems to just swallow their words because they claim to be scientists. That's what's happened repeatedly in this chamber. People don't produce the science, they say what scientists conclude and don't analyse it. And those scientists are on major grants to push the climate fraud. Real scientists don't peddle unsubstantiated fears. Scientists present science, presenting the empirical scientific data as evidence within logical scientific points, proving cause and effect. Never has anyone done that. Yet Senator David Pocock never presents any such science nor references to specific pages providing such logical scientific points. Never. Never. Extreme weather has always been with us, remains with us, and will always be with us. It's natural and often cyclical. So what's the real reason for implementing so-called sustainability standards and ESG? The Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, said it in his second reading speech to this bill. The purpose is, quote, to align capital flows to climate and sustainability goals, end of quote. To say it again, the purpose is to align capital flows to climate and sustainability goals, political goals, not scientific. Those are the goals of predatory globalist billionaires and the rent seekers who are flogging wind, solar and battery products. Billionaires peddling parasitic misinvestments in solar, wind and batteries and transferring wealth from families, small businesses and employers to billionaires, often overseas. Despite claims these solar and wind products are the cheapest, the free market has utterly failed to adopt them because they simply cannot survive in the wild on their own without subsidies. In other speeches in recent weeks, I've documented the huge number of failures in wind and solar projects overseas and here in Australia. They're falling over like flies. Billionaires behind the climate push are panicking now that their parasitic investments won't get the return they need. The Teal sugar daddy, Simon Holmes at Court, Andrew Twiggy Forrest, Johnny come lately to climate fear-mongering Mike Cannon-Brookes, old stagers Alex Turnbull and Ross Garnaut, having failed with climate scams in the free market, these climate doomsayers now need the government to direct money their way through implementation of climate standards. They're going to standardise the climate. To, as the Assistant Treasurer said, align capital flows. This is more of the crony capitalism that's ruined Australia. If it wasn't so serious, it'd be laughable. That's why I've circulated an amendment to strike out Schedule 2 of the bill. There's no reason to even start down this path of folly and pretend, hidden away in the cupboard somewhere. The government has a crystal ball they can use to predict the future. If they do, they clearly haven't used it before. A final concern I'll raise is with Schedule 1, Part 2 of the bill. This gives ASIC the power to use, quote, assisted decision-making processes, end of quote. That's their label. This amendment is incredibly broad and vague, and we can assume this will involve some level of automation and eventually the implementation of AI, artificial intelligence. It's incredibly concerning that the explanatory memorandum includes at section 1.24, that, quote, ASIC may change a decision made by an assisted decision-making process if it is satisfied the decision is wrong. Can you believe it? This very heavily implies that a human will not be involved in the decision-making process. An assisted decision-making process should only be in place to assist a human in making a decision, not for a robot using artificial intelligence to make the decision itself. The fact that Labor would introduce this blank cheque to the new robot overlords in the wake of a royal commission they called into robo-debt is a stunning revelation. If the robots get it wrong, there's no clear avenue of appeal for a person who is subject to the wrong decision. They'll simply have to rely on ASIC deciding to look at it on their own motion and finding out it's wrong. Good luck with that. This change is too broad, and One Nation is raising its concerns now so that these issues can be monitored in future. To summarise, the government would be better off going back to the drawing board on this con hiding behind the label Treasury laws. Thank you, Mr Deputy President.